Hi, good morning. This is Assemblymember Robert Rodriguez, and we're here with Represent NYC, hosted on MNN, Neighborhood Networks, Manhattan Neighborhood Networks, talking about census justice. And with us today is Lurie Daniel-Favors from the Medgar Evers Center for Law and Social Justice, and Juan Rosa from the NALEO Educational Fund. And we're talking about a topic that is critically important to our communities, particularly the Black and Brown community, when we talk about Census 2020. And I serve in the Assembly, but I also chair the legislative demographic redistricting / census task force. And an important initiative for really the last year has been trying to raise awareness about the census, make sure we put much needed resources into making sure that local organizations are aware of what the census is and its importance in the community. And supplementing the governmental efforts around completion of the census. We had begun that process, going on years ago, and many of the folks here who have been advocates since even the last census and before. So it's important for us to recognize, that this is an effort that culminates in the decennial census, but the work happens year-round in terms of making sure that our communities are represented. So to those efforts, I want to open up to our guests to introduce themselves and speak a little bit about the importance of the census. But another really important twist of this conversation is about census justice, what it means to the Latino and the Latinx communities of color, particularly around the way some of the questions are phrased. And I know Lurie has been on a panel with me before on this topic, but there's a very critical campaign that is supplementing the census campaign, or really the Check Black campaign. And we're going to talk about that and what it means in terms of social justice and equity when we check that box, and what it means to do that right now as part of this census effort. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to the guests to then introduce themselves. And maybe, Juan, as part of your intro, you can let everyone know where we are so far on our numbers, because it's in progress, underway, happening, as we speak. And maybe give them a quick update on our latest numbers for where we are and where we want to get to. So we'll open up with you, Lurie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Assembly Member. As you know, I represent the Center for Law and Social Justice, and I'm privileged to serve there as the Interim Executive Director. And as you rightly noted, we started our census outreach campaign in 2017 because we recognized that communities of African descent, which as a note, is broader than just Black communities, right? So when we say African descent, we're talking about the entire diaspora of the communities that can trace their lineage and their heritage to the continent of Africa. And we recognize that we have such a diverse set of ethnic groups and nationalities, all of whom may look similar in appearance, may have different shades of brown in common, but we represent different countries, different languages, different ethnicities. And so we started our campaign as a racial justice issue for the census back in 2017, knowing that we were going to have to speak in language that was clear and that was culturally competent and spoke directly to the needs of the very diverse portions of the Pan-African diaspora. So I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation about race, ethnicity, nationality, and how they all show up in very unique ways on the 2020 census.
Thank you. Juan, tell us about NALEO and the efforts that they've been undertaking.
Thank you so much, Assemblyman. It's a privilege to be here with you and with my colleague, Lurie. NALEO Educational Fund is the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. We are a national organization dedicated to promoting Latino political participation. By political, we mean definitely voting, becoming U.S. citizens, and every 10 years being counted and shown in the decennial census. We have our Hágase Contar campaign, which means make yourself count, which promotes the Latino participation in the census. We have hosted train-the-trainer trainings for community organizations to get expertise about census. We make ourselves available to the media so they are able to tell the story of why the census is important. We have developed ad campaigns on Facebook and on Instagram targeting Latinos, definitely here in New York, especially in the Bronx and Brooklyn, and a little bit north in Yonkers and Westchester County. And we participate in coalition with groups like Lurie's, like the Center for Law and Social Justice, because quite frankly, the situations and conditions that lead to undercount of Latino populations are really conditions that are felt elsewhere in other communities, the Black diaspora, the Asian American communities. So we do a lot of our work in coalition to make sure that we are being counted. Right now we're doing in New York, definitely because of COVID-19, but also just historically, New York has underperformed in the census. And we're seeing those trends show up again. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but it's a pleasure to be here representing the NALEO Educational Fund.
Great, thank you. And I feel like we have all been inside the census bubble for a very long time, talking about it and promoting awareness. But for some of our viewers who maybe have no idea what the census is, Lurie, let's give a little recap of what the census is, why it's important, and what it does in terms of generating and bringing resources, which, is one of those broad words, but let's say billions and billions of dollars from the federal government is what is at stake. So tell us about what this is and why people should care about it.
That's a really great question, especially for those of us who have been in this bubble for quite some time. So Census is a national survey that the Constitution requires the federal government to take every 10 years. And that national survey is designed to count every single person, regardless of citizenship, nationality, or ethnicity, but every single person who's living inside the United States. And the government is then required to take that total population count for every single community in the country, and they just feed it into formulas that determine how much money each community is going to get for schools, for hospitals, for libraries, for healthcare services, for teachers, desks, books in the classroom, after school programs, job preparation programs, transportation services, roads and highways, everything that we can think of that we as as members of this country use and participate in. It typically has some sort of funding cycle that is tied to census dollars. And so in addition to determining how much money your community is going to get, or what your slice of those billions and billions of dollars is going to be, the census is also used, that population count is also used to determine how many political representatives you're going to receive. So we always give an example. If you live in a community of 100 families, and according to the census formulas for that year, every family in that community should get $1 in education services. Well, if only 40 of those families fill out the census, that means according to the census formulas, only 40% of your community exists, which means that your community will get $40 in education services. But in September, all 100 families are going to send their children to school. But what that means is that those children are going to be educated on a budget that's only appropriate for 40 of them. Similarly with elected officials, if according to the census formulas, communities like this one of 100 families should have 10 political representatives. If only 40 of those families fill out the census, that means only, again, 40% of you exist as it pertains to political power. So you're only going to get 4 political representatives, which means every time elected officials like you, assembly member, like our city council persons, go into the halls of justice to fight for legislation that's going to benefit your constituents, you're literally short 6 of the votes that your community would be entitled to. So, and many people will often say, well, the government knows who I am, they know where I live, they should be able to figure it out. Well, while they might be able to figure it out, they are required by the Constitution to use that census count. And because it only happens every 10 years, that means you are locked into the results of that census count for a decade. So communities like mine, and many of ours, which are right now trying to navigate a pandemic with insufficient healthcare, insufficient resources for our healthcare needs. Part of the reason we're so underfunded is because in 2010, our communities were not showing up on the census. And so we're literally trying to navigate a pandemic on half of the budget that we should have because those census counts were less than half of what they should have been back in 2010.
And that's a good point, because we're not living in a bubble and it's not just an exercise. That was literally how stimulus dollars in the first CARES was calculated in terms of providing testing support. That was how they came to the equation of giving every state a certain amount of money. And now we're using that statistic where, we're only getting $25,000 per test case of COVID, where Alaska, will get millions of dollars per case because it's driven by the number of people. And we've had more people, more cases, but an undercount literally means that we get less of those dollars when the federal government uses that blanket formula to distribute aid. And so we see it happening, and it's happening in real time, even in response to this crisis. So, that is, a true example of why the census matters and why we have to do it and get it right. Not just for now, but also for the future issues that we can't and don't foresee. So Juan, you're always up on the know. How are we doing so far? Not just, New York, but also some of our undercounted communities.
So as of yesterday, the state of New York, we are about 53.7%. So 53.7 percent of people around the state of New York have responded to the census. In Manhattan, that number is 50%. So 50% of Manhattan has responded. I was just looking at areas in your district in East Harlem, and most of the census tracts in East Harlem, which contain a lot of what the census counts as hard to count communities. And we'll circle back to that later. But a lot of East Harlem is doing around the 50% mark. So your district is performing the same way Manhattan is performing at around 50%, but it is 3 percentage points below the state of New York. And just in perspective, we're a regional office at NALEO. So we work not only in New York, but we also work in Connecticut, in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. And New York right now is our lowest performing state. So states like Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, they already passed the 60% threshold. So they're about 62%, 63%. Rhode Island is struggling a little bit like New York. It's around 57%, but it's still kind of ahead. So in New York, in the statewide, we're around 53%. In Manhattan, we're about 50%. And in East Harlem, most of East Harlem hovers around 50%. And that is, again, because, not only because of the COVID crisis, right, where people are thinking about how do I afford rent? How do I put food on my table? How do I stay safe, right? Those are the things that are in people's minds right now. But traditionally, Black and brown communities in urban settings have been hard to count. A lot of our communities, the way that we live escapes, the definition of what is a quote unquote household, right? A lot of us are, I think Lurie alluded to this earlier, multi-generational, right? So a lot of us live with our grandparents or an aunt or an uncle. And when you get the census forms, sometimes the census form, it doesn't really do justice, right, to what a Latino or a Black household could look like, right? It's not mom and dad and the 2 kids and the dog, which doesn't go in the census, but it could also be grandma, grandpa, and uncle and aunt, a cousin of my mother. Those people live in our households, right? And the census questionnaire tends to confuse people a lot of times. And we're gonna get to it a little bit later, but also the race and ethnicity questions are questions that confuse Latinos and African Americans and Afro-descendant people from elsewhere as to being counted in the census.
I definitely want to get into that issue because, one of the things that struck me as I was doing my census form, and I'm knowledgeable. I sat on the panel with Lurie. I knew about the Check Black campaign, and I had just heard a Latino USA podcast on the issue, which was really informative. So I was prepared, probably as prepared as you could be, for my census. And you get to that moment, and it's a moment, right? I'm good. I check, Hispanic, Latino, we're great. Then we get to the next spot, when you get into that race question, and you're like, these don't fit. They don't exactly fit me. It's like, you cross that barrier. I'm good on Latino. Great. I hit the next one. I'm like, well, now I don't fit in any box in a really representative way, and this is where people can get stumped. And, as somebody who has small children and we speak to them about, how they identify, in very simple terms, and how we have African descent, and how I identify as, Afro-Latino, but there's nowhere for us to do that, in a meaningful way. And we know, historically, Latino and Latinx communities, have had issues about, the black and white question, and historically, why people didn't want to identify as black. So I'm gonna throw that back to Lurie, but I just wanted to share that experience. Is like, I checked I know I checked the right box because because I know how I identify, but as I was checking them for my kids and as I'm checking them for the rest of my family, because we're filling it out for them. It's about how do they identify as well. So I thought that was, striking, and I can imagine if, how long other people are spending trying to figure that out at that moment. So Lurie, tell me a little bit about that, and Juan, you can respond with, how do we deal with that in the Latinx community?
So that's a great question. And the reality is that race is a very cumbersome, inexact science. It's a man-made construct, right? Which is why race and racial identification can shift depending on what country you live in. Many, many years ago when I was in college, I spent a year living in the Dominican Republic. And even though I am a woman of African descent, my mother is Jamaican, my father is American. Both of them are black and would be physically identified as black if you were to look at them. When I lived in the Dominican Republic, everyone told me, oh, you're not black, you're India. Maybe India Morena, depending on if I had a good tan, right? And so it was really interesting for me to realize just the ways in which our countries have had to grapple with what frankly is a history of the enslavement of African and indigenous people and the racial blends that come between Europeans, Africans, and indigenous communities as a result of that history. And so what we need to understand is that you may identify nationally. Perhaps you identify as Dominican or as Cuban or as Colombian or Brazilian or Nigerian or Ghanaian or Jamaican. That is your nationality. That is different than your ethnicity or your race, right? Because you have white Americans, you have people who in the Latinx community look like white people, and then you find out they are part of the Latinx community, and so it sort of puts a slight curve on how you see them racially. You may be from Nigeria, which is your nationality, but you are a part of the ethnic group known as the Yoruba or the Igbo or the Hausa. That's your ethnicity. Racially, however, country considered black. Now, internationally speaking, when we hear the word black as applied to people, we often think of it as a very American thing. Black Americans are a specific cultural group, which makes perfect sense because again, nationality, ethnicity, and race are different things. However, when you are someone who has never had to identify as a particular race, for example, my mother, when she came here from Jamaica, she had not identified as black before that point. She identified as Jamaican because everybody was black. There was no need for this sort of categorization of different people. And when she came here, she realized, oh, wait a minute, they think I'm black, even though I'm Jamaican, I look black. And so that's how I'm being treated and interpreted in the world. On the census, identity for the Latinx community shows up in 3 different ways. The first is a question about whether or not you are part of the Hispanic community, right? And I know that there are some concerns with the phrasing, and trust me, advocacy around how the census is worded is something that we all engage in. But then after you answer that question, that's speaking to your ethnicity, right? That's not speaking to your nationality because you might be Hispanic from Mexico, from Dominican Republic. You may be Hispanic from any of these places. That is just whether or not you are part of that particular ethnic group. The very next question asks you to select a race. And if you are from a country where race is not identified in the same way as it is here, staring at that question, wondering exactly how does this apply to you? What's important for everyone to know is that in this country, regardless of how you may identify personally, regardless of how you may feel politically about the word black, the reality is in this country, black is what we call a protected racial category, which means when we go into court to fight for voting rights, for civil rights, for anti-discrimination laws, for employment protections, we do so on the basis of race. So when it comes to the census, part of the reason we launched the Check Black campaign was to let people know, listen, it doesn't matter where you come from in the world. If you trace your heritage back to the continent of Africa, vis-a-vis the Latinx experience, vis-a-vis the Afro-Caribbean experience or the African immigrant experience, whether you identify personally as a black person is not the question. The question is, are you racially what this country would consider a black person. So we let people know, listen, this is not the place to have a moral quandary. This is not the place to be internally upset about how you truly identify. This is a place for us to be strategic about ensuring that all of our communities have access to the resources and benefits that we are entitled to. I would like to also add that during the 1950s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, when we begin to see waves of Latinx communities entering the United States, there was a concerted campaign that they should check white, that they should not be listed as white, as Black people. They should not identify as anything other than white. And that is a part of a strategic campaign that really seeks to determine whose numbers matter the most. And we see that all countries have done it in this hemisphere. We saw in Argentina when the doors of immigration were open to European countries and closed to other countries. So many governments will engage in these types of practices. So it's important for our communities to know that there are protections that come with identifying racially as a Black person if your ethnic, if your bloodline, if your heritage is that includes part of the African diaspora.
And I think it's also important to bring it back to dollars and cents, right? Programs that go towards communities of color that help support, places that we love. I just want to give a special shout out to the Center, CCC-ADI, the Center for Caribbean and African Diaspora Institute in East Harlem. Those kind of nonprofits are continually and consistently underfunded. And part of that is because we don't have a clear sense of identifying that dollars need to go towards these organizations. And it's really almost a strategic decision, as you mentioned, to make sure that we check that so that we can support programming like that and different kinds of organizations that meet different social needs and social responsibilities and obligations in our community that are not going to get it otherwise if you're checking white, because they wouldn't serve that community on the surface, versus checking Black, which is exactly where we want those resources to go. So it's a mental exercise. Now, it's a very tough one for my Latinx community. Juan, how has NALEO attacked that?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Robert, for your question. It's imperfect, right? So we did a lot of work as NALEO in partnership with other national organizations between 2014 and 2017 to change the way that the census approaches the race and ethnicity question, because it is imperfect, because it is confusing, and because it doesn't allow to show the real diversity in our community, like Lurie alluded to. So, for example, it's very common to have, a Mexican Puerto Rican child, right? A Dominican Guatemalan child, right? The census right now would only allow, will pick, if you put more than two national origins, it will pick one, right? It won't let you tabulate two. You could put it, but when it's time to tabulate the census at the end, it won't let you count it, right? So since 2014 to 2017, we did a lot of work and make it into something that was more, that allowed for more diversity to be shown, right? So for example, right now it gives you certain options. So it says you're Black Jamaican, or you're Black from some of the other Caribbean countries or African countries. NALEO was pushing to add Dominican, for example, or Puerto Rican, mainly Dominican, because what that would do is that it will tell Latinos that identify as Black, I identify as Black, just so you know. It will tell Latinos who are Black, okay, well, I see Jamaican, but I also see Dominican. I'm Puerto Rican, but I go there. That's where I go, right? What's happening now is that a lot of Latinos are either leaving that blank, and what happens at the end is that the Census Bureau actually gives you a race if you leave it blank. Or they're putting all the way at the end, there is a some other race category. Some other race exists only in the Census Bureau. Some other race does not exist in any of the other agencies that collect racial data, right? Which the standards for those are set by the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. So that agency sets the standards for how race is requested of people, right? How do you self-identify in our country? And only the census has a category that says some other race. And we expect that the Latinos who are confused about their race, right, are either going to leave it blank And what happens is that at the end, the Bureau will tell them what race they are, or that they're going to hit some other race, which again does not exist in OMB. It only exists in the Census Bureau. So those people, again, will be given another race.
So before we end up and switching and having this conversation again in Spanish, to wrap it up, it's go time, right? What's happening now? What advice, what can we tell our neighbors who are watching this? How can we encourage them to do something, and what do we tell them exactly they should do?
Start by visiting my2020census.gov or calling 844-330-2020. Why? Because now for the first time, you can fill out the census online. It's 10 questions, takes less than 10 minutes, and it literally determines the next 10 years of our lives. And if you're not comfortable filling it out online, you can call that number 844-330-2020 and fill out the census over the phone with one of the Census Bureau employees who will help you navigate the questionnaire.
And Juan, what do we do for those hard to counts? How do we start, getting the buzz that we need to, and what would you advise?
Yeah, so I think call your friends, call your family. If you're in college, call, whatever group you're part of, whatever sorority, fraternity you're part of. Make sure that the circles around you are participating in the census. Look, right now we are in a time of extreme emergency, right? And the next 10 years are not going to be about growth. The next 10 years are going to be about reconstruction. And in order for us to have economic and social reconstruction, we need to have an accurate picture of who's in our country. Doesn't matter your immigration status, your citizenship status, how old you are, as long as you are alive, you count in the census, and you count for us to make plans for the next 10 years. So like Lurie said, please go to www.my2020census.gov, fill it out, participate, and then after you do that, call your friends, put it on Facebook, put it on Instagram. Whatever you do, whatever circles you are influential, use your influence.